And we've had the Anita Hill hearings, a president and an intern that led to impeachment proceedings, Woody Allen, Roman Polanski, Bill Cosby, Bill O'Reilly, Roger Ailes, and a man elected president after we all heard him on tape talking about what fame allowed him to do to women. Some suggested that the election of Donald Trump was proof that it just didn't matter, that we had come to a kind of acceptance of, at the very least, boorish behavior from powerful or famous men. Well, #MeToo would suggest otherwise. So, why is it different now? Or maybe a better question is, how do we make sure that it is different this time? It's This Morning on Flashpoint. Let's follow the lead of #MeToo. I've got a great group to discuss how to move forward. Kim Trent back with us, the head of the AA 490 Challenge, which of course was devoted to all of these problems with getting rape kits tested in Detroit. Portia Roberson is the civil rights chief for the city of Detroit. The other side of the table, Christina Lovio-George, the CEO of Lovio-George, the Detroit PR firm. And great to have Nia Batts with us. She has brought Detroit Blows, the Blow Bar Salon, to downtown, but a long time, former native Detroiter, yeah, but a former marketing executive for Viacom in Los Angeles and New York, who has now moved back to Detroit. So great to have you back in your hometown. I guess this is where I just mostly want to sit back and listen. But I will start with the point that I made at the beginning, Kim. Why do we feel that this is somehow different now? It has been different to look at all of, and maybe it's just the power of social media, but why there is a moment to grasp here. How do we make sure that there's progress out of it this time?
Well, you know, I'm going to say something you'll probably never hear me say again, and that's that I agree with the Detroit News editorial page this week, where there was a discussion about the fact that this was a bit of a lost opportunity, because even though I forwarded the Me Too thing, and I was shocked, and I've been in this work for a couple of years now, I was shocked really at the number of women who replied Me Too. Yeah. But it said, the hashtag was about sexual assault and sexual harassment. And I do think that it would have been so much more powerful if we just talked about sexual assault, because I think that number would have been even more shocking to people. I don't think people really understand how many women experience sexual assault. I think that people think that that's still something that, I mean, there was a statistic a few years ago where a poll showed that about 60% of black women at the age of 18 have already been the victim of some kind of sexual misconduct. 60%, and that's at 18. So when you think about the enormity of that problem and how that's still kind of a silent problem, I wish that we had kind of carved that out. And sexual harassment, I honestly don't know a single human woman who hasn't experienced sexual harassment at some point in her life. Every
you sound
woman.
Like you're giving up on that one then.
No, I don't give up on that. Not at all. No, not at all. Yeah. But I don't think that it is, I don't think people should be shocked that people have
I think this is a really interesting
that.
part of the conversation, Portia, because I have seen this part of the conversation online, that if we let it be about so many things, then it ends up being about too many things, and you can't move forward. And yet, some would argue, whether you're talking about the Larry Nassar case and these young gymnasts who, if all these allegations are true, it's just beyond horrific. If you include, you know, child sexual predation in this long sweep of things, then it really does remind you that this is all about the way that women are treated because they're women.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to
and
divide
I think
it up.
Without a doubt, there is a concern about diminishing, as Kim said, the violent sort of sexual assault versus sexual harassment, and certainly almost dividing sexual assault against an adult woman against a child. So there are so many facets to what happens. I have to agree with Kim that, you know, I don't know women who have not had a comment made or some even form of touching, which in and of itself is in fact sexual assault, but we don't consider it that. Women don't necessarily consider it that, because if some guy grazes his hand across your rear end, you don't really consider it sexual assault in the same way you consider somebody grabbing you on a corner and pulling you in and sexually assaulting, raping you. So I think there is the concern that while I think the power of social media has allowed men and women to see how many people are responding with Me Too, there is the concern about maybe we diminish sort of parts of it by having all of it included in that Me Too campaign.
Nia, I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying you're the youngest member of the group here, but you have worked in the media worlds in both New York and Los Angeles, and they're very central to how this started to spill out, though. And I'm really curious as to your reflections about the kind of, I think in some ways we see in young people an acceptance of how the world kind of works, and yet in others we've read in a lot of these posts an unacceptance of how things work.
Definitely. I mean, I feel as though you have lots of people who have felt voiceless. And what social media has the opportunity to do is sort of give voice to the voiceless. And I think that there are many people who felt brave by seeing other women share stories that were similar to their own in many respects, like a common story, which is the part that's very unfortunate. You know, I think that these perpetrators of sexual assault are emboldened by silence of their peers, by bystanders, people who are working in these, you know, professional settings and have the opportunities every day to take a stand, to voice concern, and don't. And then that makes the culture of those organizations and those industries even, you know, really hotbeds for this type of
really important point, and I want to say that in the future I do want to host a conversation just involving men on this topic, because we've had a lot of enabling going on with men who I think have known what they've seen around them and did not act. Christina, you and I have been friends for a long time, and you have seen an awful lot. We were just saying before the program, the ebb and flow of the way that workplace relationships, workplace atmospheres have changed, but in your mind, the outcomes have not.
Yes, and I think that's, you know, probably why I'm, I don't want to say pessimistic, but not optimistic about this point in our history that we are still grappling, and certainly sexual assault is something that we've got to be armed by law and by advocates and by defenders of women who have faced that. The judge notwithstanding in Sanilac, even though he
ended up changing his decision,
right.
Yes.
But where I'm worried is we as women don't look at what we can do to affect outcomes. And, you know, my first sexual encounter was at the corner drugstore on Cardone and 7 Mile Road, and I was leaning over the counter and a guy put his hand down my blouse and grabbed me.
In a drugstore? In
a drugstore that I worked at as a 14-year-old. And when the owner came back, a woman, I told her, and she marched me down the block to that guy's father and said, tell him. That was the worst punishment for the son, right? But the outcome,
there you go.
Right, not what happened to me, but the outcome that I'm looking for is how we as women say, all right, all of you companies that are getting rid of birth control coverage but keeping Viagra, we're not buying your products anymore.
Yes.
I had wondered if the politics that are related around all this were somehow inescapable, and I guess you just answered. Interesting. How do we move forward then, Portia? What do we do?
Well, I mean, I think, again, first of all, as much as we don't want to diminish the conversation by having it encompass everything, I think the fact that the conversation is happening is so important. And I think, you know, what you've seen now in recent years, and I think it's probably because of social media, and it's also probably because you have men who are considered to be famous or successful being accused of this. So now more people are coming out to say, if that woman has the courage to stand up against that guy, I can have the courage to stand up against the guy who did something to me. And so I think part of what has to happen and what hopefully will come from this is that women will be less afraid to say that this is happening to them. I mean, that's the first step. I think Nia's absolutely right. Silence has been the reason why men have not been called out on their behavior. And so as women begin to feel more empowered about the fact that we're not going to accept inexcusable behavior. You know, we're not going to say boys will be boys. We will then have outcomes in terms of criminal prosecutions, if that's what it needs, and we will have women saying to their husbands, daughters saying to their fathers, that behavior is unacceptable, and starting to shut it down where at its source.
I would expect, Kim, that we will, there's another opportunity this week, coming up this week, as we've got this big, huge women's conference coming up at Cobo here in Detroit. So hope that there is an opportunity to have these conversations, but I guess my same question, what should they be about?
I think, first of all, I think men have to have conversations with men, and there has to be accountability where men are telling men that behavior is unacceptable. But the thing that's so insidious about this kind of behavior and rape culture in general is that rape culture is not just perpetuated by men. Women enable. We saw in the Harvey Weinstein case, women who would come in and almost act like pimps, who would come in and let the woman feel comfortable by her presence. It was on purpose, so then they could sneak out the back door and leave them alone knowing that he was a predator. And when you see on social media, when there are discussions about these issues, I hate to echo what Christina said, but I feel kind of a deep sense of pessimism. I think that until both men and women have really strong conversations about who's at fault with rape, because the only person at fault when you have a sexual assault is the person who perpetuates the sexual assault. And I don't think that our society in general has really accepted that. There's always still this conversation about what did the woman do to deserve that?
Well, then let's talk then, I'd love to have all of you weigh in a little bit about what acceptable male behavior is all about in the workplace. Yeah, I think some men, I've been a part of these conversations before where they say, you know, if you're flirting with a woman who's interested in you at work, then that's fine. That's just sort of a workplace romance. If you're flirting with someone who finds you abhorrent or isn't interested, it very quickly becomes inappropriate workplace behavior and in some cases sexual harassment. So I want everybody to talk about how men ought to be behaving in the workplace.
You know, I think that men should behave just as humans, meaning that as you have conversations with people and interact with them, it's them as a person. It's not sexualizing someone in a workplace environment because that's not what you're there for or to do. I think that there are always going to be friendly relationships between men and women in these environments, and I think that, conversations about consent, even in sort of the inception of any type of relationships, are important, and having those conversations so that people understand if you are comfortable or uncomfortable. But I think just as a general rule, what we have to do is try and find ways to make professional settings more professional. Because that's what allows for this culture of fear and power to really silence women. And it happens in a very systemic manner. We saw it in the Valley over the past few months where you had women founders that were coming out and saying that this is affecting our ability to capitalize our companies because I'm going into a professional setting and it's quickly turning into how my body is in this space as opposed to how my idea is in this space. And that's a problem.
What worries me is that this is not about sex. This is about power.
Sure.
And the least powerful among us, the most vulnerable among us, the single mom that needs to put a meal on the table or pay the mortgage or the light bill, is afraid, no matter what the support system is, to come forward and risk losing that job and that lifeline. That happened 40 years ago, and that is still happening today. I don't know what we can do as women to prevent that. I think part of it is economic. We just simply have to stop buying products from companies that lack the character that we need.
If you can dig out and find examples and proof of what's going on.
Right.
The other interesting thing that's interesting in this power dynamic, women have had to fight so hard for every bit of power and respect that they can get in the workplace that has led, I think, to, most women will tell me that women can be awful to other women in the workplace and maybe not always having each other's back at the right time. That's also fed by the way that the power structure works in a workplace.
Yeah, there's truth to that, but I don't know that, I kind of feel like maybe that's sort of, again, diminishing the behavior of a predator in terms of that women are not supportive of one another. I may not I don't think I'm a mean girl at work, and I wouldn't want to be a mean girl at work. But if I was, that still doesn't give a man who might be more powerful than I any right to sexualize myself or the person that is my coworker. So I'm not sure that that's not a little bit of, again, a little bit of victim blaming, and what we don't do for other women means that men can act a certain way towards us.
It's just the start of a terribly important discussion. Great conversation. Thank you all very much for being here. Appreciate your thinking on it. When we come back, Detroit has sent off its big package of "Why don't you come see us" to Amazon. We'll talk about that. We continue on Flashpoint right after this. Welcome back. We have talked a lot on this program about the bid to bring Amazon's HQ2 to Detroit, this huge nationwide competition, if you will. The competition is now basically over. Everybody submitted their bids this past Thursday, including the city of Detroit. Let's talk about it. Kirk Penho back with us again from Detroit, or Crane's Detroit Business, and Daniel House from the Detroit News. And I guess the upshot now is what is our real shot of landing this enormous fish, Daniel?
Well, it depends who you talk to. I mean, I think some people have already judged it.
I'm talking to you.
Some people have already judged it over. One of our local publications said that this week. It's already over. I think it's our job to call balls and strikes at this point and see where it goes. Detroit could be an interesting narrative for Amazon. It's in the middle of the country. It's reinventing itself. Yep. It's got a reinvigorated community, civic community, which I think was on display as they were putting together this bid. One of the things that I've been remarking on for some period of time now, I think we saw this coming out of the Detroit bankruptcy, and now we saw it again here, is real alignment between business and political leaders, Republicans and Democrats, city and suburb. I think for the first time, people really are cooperating. If anything comes out of this that's lasting, I think it's going to be that sentiment.
Which is not a terrible, benefit to get out of this effort. Kirk, what are your thoughts? And while you're talking about it, we're going to show you some of this video that was released on Thursday, which is part of the bid. Here it is. The basic theme of this is "Move Here, Move the World." If you're from Detroit, Kirk, I think this gives you goosebumps. The question is, does it give goosebumps to Amazon?
Well, it really kind of depends, as Daniel said, who you ask. Bloomberg had a piece today or yesterday, maybe, that put Detroit in the top 10. Moody's, within the last couple of days, ranked it maybe 45th. Just slightly ahead of Grand Rapids. So the handicappers will prognosticate as much as they want, but it really comes down to what Jeff Bezos and his team see. Which
has been the really hard thing of trying to read this through the whole thing, is what he wants. But an interesting thing I thought also was came out this week, which is not everybody was interested in being a part of the bidding. Right. San Jose and San Antonio, two big cities that have been pretty hot for a lot of reasons, decided to sit it out for a couple of reasons, I guess. Number one, just not enjoying the idea of a competition for who could come up with the most corporate welfare. Right. But others, I think, Daniel, are worried about the can your city handle this kind of growth? When you're talking about $50,000, $100,000 a year jobs,
huge bite.
The damage, I don't want to say damage, the impact to your real estate market alone is enormous.
Well, and public services.
Sure.
I don't think there's any question about that. But we are moving into an era right here that's something we haven't seen in a long time, which is big companies going public with their intentions. It wasn't just Amazon. Foxconn Technology has created a feeding frenzy, particularly in the industrial Midwest. Michigan is still in the hunt for some follow-on investment. And Toyota Motor Corporation, usually very quiet, plays their cards very close to the vest, said, hey, we're going to build a plant in the United States, publicly. So I think now these companies just do not care that they create these feeding frenzies. I mean, I think they're looking for and the best deal isn't just how big of a check. I think it's a whole matrix of things they're putting together.
In fact, Kirk, Dan Gilbert was pretty adamant that that a big company like Amazon, he expects that there's more nuance to what they want. They want something more than they need to see something other than just writing the biggest check.
Yeah, they from what Dan told us, and based on his discussions with Amazon, he believes that there are certain X factors that'll weigh into this that goes beyond just a big check from the state. Certainly, I would be shocked if there was no incentives involved, but there will certainly be some sort of incentives put on the table. But Gilbert's team and his lieutenants believe it's far more complex and robust than that.
He was also adamant on this, on the international portion of this. I think a lot of people, I've come to have a new respect for the University of Waterloo, for example, in Ontario, which apparently is one of the leading software universities in North America outside of Silicon Valley, and that kind of stuff.
That's where BlackBerry came from.
Exactly right. Yes, yes. So maybe we underrated that Windsor, Ontario partnership early on.
Well, I would give them credit for doing something we saw happen in the Super Bowl more than a decade ago, which was, back then they realized Detroit can't be Miami. It's never going to be Miami. So you have to be what you are. You have to be authentic. And I think what they're trying to do in this case with the whole Windsor binational connection is say, hey, we are the only city in North America, we are the only U.S. city that lies north of the Canadian border. And we have more border crossings coming. The real business center of the entire country of Canada is in southern Ontario, really between where we are here and pretty much the east side of Toronto. I mean, that's where it's all located. And you can tap into that, and it's pretty easy to get back and forth. You have great train service in Canada along that corridor, and of course 401, which they basically are working on all the time.
Yeah, the international component of it is a big deal. In the website, the promotional stuff that they put out this week, they touted 6,000 people crossing the border every day to come here, which is not a tiny amount of people, certainly. But Gilbert also understands that Amazon is actually going to be considering the region based on its pull from like a 5-hour radius, which gives us access to talent from Carnegie Mellon, the University of Chicago, others that you wouldn't typically think of when you think of the Detroit metropolitan statistical area.
We'll see what happens. The bid went out this past Thursday, and it's just as fascinating a competition as I can recall on a national scene. Guys, thanks very much for your thoughts on it. We'll wrap things up for Flashpoint right after this on Local 4. Before we go, don't forget to join us for the only mayoral debate between the incumbent, Mayor Mike Duggan, and the challenger, State Senator Coleman Young II. It is this Wednesday, the 25th. We will have it for you at 8 p.m. live right here from our WDIV local studios, Local 4 studios, rather, in downtown Detroit. I'll be the moderator. I certainly hope you'll be watching. Thanks so much for being with us this Sunday morning. Meet the Press coming up next, right after Mitch Albom's Heart of Detroit. We'll see you next time right back here, Flashpoint.